Hey everybody, this video is on your indicator compliance related reports, which is one set of reports from your Wyoming Special Education Data Share Out reports. I'm Susie Wagner, President of Data Driven Enterprises, and I'm doing this video on behalf of Margie Robertson and Sheila Tamala of the Division of Special Education, Wyoming Department of Education. So in this video, I'll be walking you through your indicator compliance related reports on the Wyoming SpedLink site. So this report is just one set of many reports that are available to you on the SpedLink. And specifically, the indicator compliance related report goes over these actually 5 indicators: indicator 4, 9 and 10, 11, and 13. So you'll find it on Wyoming SpedLink. You'll go to the site, enter your email and password to log in. You'll then click on reporting and then static reports. You want to make sure the 2021-22 school year is selected. And for level, you'll either select state or district. And then you will want to click on Indicator Compliance Related Report under Statewide, as well as your own district report. Once you have those reports, we of course want you to look them over. And so let me show you what this report consists of, and I'll share the statewide report with you. So the first report in this compliance related report is your discipline data that you reported on the WDE 636. This data feeds into our indicator 4 calculations. And so for the 21-22 school year, indicator 4 is a data lag, so we actually use the 2021 data. So we're a little ahead of the game here. We're showing you your 21-22 scores. What we want you to do here is to look at the numbers and make sure that they make sense. Make sure that your data is accurate, and then notice any cells that are highlighted. So if there's been an increase or decrease of 10 or more in your numbers, or 10% or more in the percent difference, we flag those. That doesn't mean anything's wrong. It just means that there was a relatively large increase or decrease, and we want you to look at, make sure they're okay. So for example, at the state level, we can see that the number of out-of-school suspensions, expulsions greater than 10 days increased by 56 students, which is about a 34% increase. So you can see in 2021, there were 165 students with disabilities who had more than 10 days of suspensions. In 21-22, there were 221. And we can see other changes here as well. So for example, I'll just highlight a couple. The number of students with disabilities who had between 2 and 10 days of suspensions, expulsions, they could have been in school or out of school, increased by 277, which is a 36% increase. And then lastly, this one shows the number of disciplinary removals. So we're not talking about unique students here, we're talking about total number of removals. So maybe one student with disabilities may have had 20 of these removals. And we can see that there was a large increase by 992 from 2021 to 21-22, which is a 33% increase. So the conclusion here is statewide, there's been an increase in the number of students with disabilities receiving disciplinary removals, and there's also been an increase in the total number of disciplinary removals. The next report is indicators 9 and 10, which looks at disproportionate representation. And this shows for indicator 9, it indicates the number of students with disabilities who were identified for special education, what their identification rate is, and then it compares it to students in the other racial ethnic groups. So for example, let's look at Native Americans. There were 682 Native Americans who were identified for special education in 2021-22. And if we look at their enrollment, it comes up to 23.38% of enrolled Native American students in K-12 were identified for special education. If we compare this to non-Native Americans, which had a rate of 14.3%, that indicates that Native Americans had a 1.62, were 1.62 times more likely to be identified for special education than non-Native Americans. And so what you want to look at over here is, are any rates 3 or higher? So if this would have been 3, that would have meant we are identifying 3 times as many Native Americans than non-Native Americans for special education. As it ends up, we're identifying about 1.5 times more Native Americans. If it's 3.0 or higher, that means the state, WDE, will contact you to explain your policies and procedures. So you can have disproportionate representation. What the state then wants to determine is if you have inappropriate identification practices going on. So maybe you have a rate of 3.5 over here, but the state does their review and determines that you're not doing anything inappropriate in terms of identification. So the first part, disproportionate representation, is just a flag of whether or not the numbers suggest that there are some inappropriate policies and practices. Indicator 10 looks at the same thing, except here we're looking at it by disability. So we want to know, for example, what's the percentage of Native Americans identified for autism? How does that compare to non-Native Americans? And is that rate 3.0 or higher? So you can see statewide, where the closest we get is this 2.09, the closest to 3.0, which is Native Americans for speech language. So statewide, it appears that things are looking good, but of course that varies by district. You'll also note that there's some missing final risk ratios. That just means that the minimum cell size was not met. So there has to be at least 10 students with disabilities in a particular group for us to consider the final risk ratio. If it's missing, it means don't worry about it. Otherwise, on your report, be sure to look, as I've said, for those rates 3.0 or higher, and also look for any rates between 2.0 and 2.99. That just suggests that maybe you're getting a little close and you might want to do some looking at your files for particular groups of students to make sure that there are no inappropriate identification practices going on. And let me just give you one more example because I know this can be real confusing. So let's look at, okay, how about Hispanic students with autism up here? What this tells me is that there were 118 Hispanic students with autism, and that represents 0.89% of all Hispanic students enrolled in districts across the state. If we compare this identification rate to non-Hispanic students, which happens to be 1.08%, so 849 non-Hispanic students across the state were identified with autism. So if we divide 0.89 divided by 0.108, we get 0.83. So this tells us that Hispanics are a little less likely to be identified for autism than non-Hispanic students. The next report is indicator 11, timely evaluations. And this shows how many initial consent for evaluations were received in a given school year, and then what % of those took place within 60 days. So in 21-22, there were 1,746 K-12 evaluations received. 1,710 of them were evaluated on time. That translates to 97.94%. And so here you can see we have about 36 evaluations that were not evaluated on time. And so these 36 are part of the statewide self-assessment that is currently going on. So be sure if one of these 36 are at your district, you provide us a reason as to why they were late. And then some of those reasons are acceptable, and so we will adjust the rate accordingly. When you look at your report, one thing I want you to notice is the total number of consents received in a given year. So you can see in 1920, it decreased quite a bit, most likely due to COVID. But then notice in 21-22, we have a decrease as well. So look at your numbers and see if you've had a decrease and why you might have experienced that decrease. And then the last report is indicator 13, which looks at the transition planning for IEPs of students with disabilities age 16 or older. There are 8 questions that are answered. Question number 8 is one where you could say it's not applicable, which is why there were fewer questions answered here. So you'll want to look at your report and see for each question what percentage of files met the indicator. That's good. What percentage did not? And then at the bottom, it will tell you overall what percent of files met all 8 questions. So statewide, we had 95.17% of files meet the indicators. So there were 20 files that did not, and 4.83% of state files that did not meet the indicator. And so that's the end of your compliance-related report. Be sure to look at this. If you find that there's a problem, you will want to make sure you contact Sheila, because this information feeds into your report card, which ultimately feeds into your determinations. Thank you very much.